Chapter 6. Full steam ahead. When they heard him shout, the full ship's company rushed to where the harpooner was standing. Captain, officers, and petty officers, sailors and ship's boys. Everyone down to the mechanics who abandoned their engines and the stokers who deserted their furnaces. The order to heave to had been given, and the frigate was being carried forward by nothing more than its own momentum. It was now pitch dark, and however keen the Canadian's eyesight, I wondered how he had been able to see it all, and what it was that he had seen. My heart was thumping, as if it was about to burst. But Ned Land had not been mistaken, and we all saw the object he was pointing at. Not 2 cables' length from the Abraham Lincoln, off the starboard beam, the sea looked as if it were being lit from below. It was not just a straightforward occurrence of the phenomenon of phosphorescence. There was no possibility of error over that. The monster now lying a few fathoms beneath the surface of the water was emitting the same intense but inexplicable illumination which had been mentioned in the reports of a number of ship's masters. Its fierce radiance could only have been produced by some hugely powerful means. The part which was lit formed a great, elongated oval in the center, of which was the source of the blinding incandescence. Its unbearable brilliance was then progressively reduced in a series of decreasing stages. "Why, it's just a mass of phosphorescent molecules!" exclaimed one of the officers. "Not so," I replied with conviction. "Neither Pidox nor Salpe ever give off such intense light. This brilliance is essentially electric in nature. Anyway, look there. It's changing position. It's moving forward. Now back. It's making straight for us." A general shout went up from the frigate. "Silence!" cried Captain Farragut. "Lay the helm hard over. Make full astern." The crew rushed to the helm, and the engine men to their posts. The steam power was immediately reversed, and the Abraham Lincoln, beating to port, described a semicircle. "Right the helm. Make full ahead," cried Captain Farragut. His orders were executed with alacrity, and the frigate, making speed, sailed away from the source of the light. But I am mistaken. We attempted to move away, but the supernatural creature caught us up, traveling at twice our speed. Our breathing was shallow and rapid, but it was astonishment, not fear, that froze our tongues and rooted us to the spot. The animal gained on us, and started playing with us. It raced round the frigate, which was then making 14 knots, and covered us with electric charges like so much luminous dust. Then it shot off to a distance of 2 or 3 miles, leaving a wake of phosphorescence similar to the clouds of steam that trail the locomotive of an express train. And now, from the dark edges of the horizon, where it had retreated to start its run, it suddenly bore down on the Abraham Lincoln with terrifying speed, pulled up just 20 feet short of our gunwales, and extinguished its light. Not by sinking beneath the waters, because its brilliance did not fade gradually, but instantly, as if the source of the blinding light it gave off had suddenly failed. Then it reappeared on the other side of the ship, either having sailed round us or under the hull. At any moment there could be a collision which might have proved fatal to us. But I was amazed by the frigate's response. Instead of attacking, we beat a retreat. The ship which was supposed to pursue was itself being pursued. I turned and put this to Captain Farragut. His face, normally so impassive, was suffused with an expression of indescribable amazement. "Professor Aronnax," he said, "I have no idea what kind of formidable opponent I am up against, and I do not intend to do anything in this darkness that would put my ship at risk. Besides, how am I to attack an unknown enemy? How can I defend my ship? Let us wait for daylight, and the roles will change." "Do you have any remaining doubts, Captain, about the nature of the animal?" "No, Professor. It's obviously a colossal narwhal, which also happens to be electric." "Perhaps," I added, "we should no more try to approach it than we would an electric eel or an electric ray." Quite right, said the captain. And if it does indeed possess colossal electric power within it, then it is quite certainly the most terrifying animal ever put on this earth by the hand of the Creator. That is why, Professor, I intend to stay on my guard. The entire crew remained on the alert all night. No one thought of sleep. The Abraham Lincoln, unable to outrun the creature, had slowed and was maintaining half speed. The narwhal, tracking the frigate, let itself be carried along by the action of the waves, but appeared quite determined not to quit the field of battle. But around midnight it disappeared, or to put it more accurately, it extinguished itself, like some huge glow-worm. Had it run away? This was something more to be feared than hoped for. But at 12:53 in the morning, a deafening whooshing noise was heard. It was like the sound made by a column of water being shot up into the air with extreme violence. Captain Farragut, Ned Land, and I were then on the poop, peering avidly into the pitch blackness. Ned Land, asked the captain, you have often heard whales exhaling through their blowholes? Frequently, sir, but never the kind of whale whose sighting has netted me $2,000. Ah, yes. You're entitled to the reward. But tell me, is this the same noise that cetaceans make when they blow water out through their spiracles? It is, sir, but incomparably louder. There's no way I can be mistaken. There is definitely a cetacean there, in our waters. With your permission, Captain, added the harpooner, we'll have a little word with him tomorrow when the sun is up. If, that is, he's in a mood to listen to what you have to tell him, Mr. Land, the captain replied, sounding less than convinced. Let me get to within 4 harpoon lengths of him, the Canadian retorted, and he'll have to listen. But if we want to get near it, the captain went on, will I need to break out a whaleboat for you? Certainly, sir. Would I thereby be putting the lives of my men at risk? And mine too, the harpooner said simply. Around 2 in the morning, the source of the light reappeared, just as bright, 5 miles windward of the Abraham Lincoln. Despite the distance and the noise of wind and sea, we could distinctly hear the fearsome beating of the creature's tail, even its rapid breathing. We had a sense that when the huge narwhal finally came to the surface of the ocean to blow, air would rush into its lungs the way steam is sucked into the huge piston cylinders of an engine capable of generating 2,000 horsepower. I thought. A whale with the strength of a cavalry regiment must be a pretty large whale. We remained on full alert until daybreak and got ready to do battle. The special fishing tackle was set up along the side of the ship's rails. A second officer gave the order to load the guns that can fire a harpoon a distance of a mile, and likewise the swivel guns that shoot explosive shells, causing injuries fatal even to the largest animals. Ned Land kept himself busy, sharpening his harpoon, a terrible weapon in his hands. By 6, dawn was just breaking, and with the first rays of the sun, the electric light given off by the narwhal disappeared. At 7, the day was well advanced, but a very dense morning mist reduced our horizons so that even the most powerful telescopes could not see through it. The result was disappointment and frustration. I climbed up the mizzenmast. A number of officers were already there, perched around the masthead. At 8, the fog still sat heavily on the waves, but gradually its swirling eddies lifted. The horizon receded, and as it did, grew clearer. Then, exactly like the night before, the voice of Ned Land rang out. The object we're hunting! There, astern, on the port quarter. All eyes turned in the direction of his pointing finger. A mile and a half from the frigate, a long blackish object was showing about a meter out of the water. Its tail was beating furiously, making the water boil. No mortal tail had ever lashed the sea with greater power. A huge wake, blindingly white, marked the passage of the animal in the form of an elongated curve. The frigate approached the cetacean. I was able to examine it, keeping an open mind. The reports made by the Shannon and the Helvetia had rather exaggerated its size. I judged its length to be not more than 250 feet. As to its overall bulk, I found it hard to come up with an estimate, but overall the animal seemed to me admirably proportioned in all three dimensions. While I was observing this phenomenal creature, 2 jets of vapor and water were released from its spiracles to a height of 40 meters. This drew my attention to the way it breathed. I came to the definitive conclusion that it belonged to the branch of vertebrates, the class of mammals, the subclass of Monodelphia, to the Pisciform group, the order of cetaceans, the family of... At this point I found I could not proceed with certainty. The order of cetaceans is made up of 3 families, whale, cachalot, and dolphin, and it is among the last that the narwhals is classified. Each of these families is divided into several genera, each genus into species and each species into varieties. The precise variety, species, genus, and family still eluded me, but I had no doubt that I would complete my classification with the help of Heaven and Captain Farragut. The whole crew were waiting expectantly for the captain's orders. After observing the animal closely, Captain Farragut summoned the chief engineer, who arrived at the double. "Well, Chief," said the captain, "do we have full pressure?" "Yes, sir," said the chief engineer. "In that case, stoke your fires high and make full steam ahead." The order was received with 3 cheers. The hour for battle had struck. Only moments later, torrents of black smoke poured from both the frigate's funnels, and the deck shook with the judder of the boilers. The Abraham Lincoln, urged forward by the thrust of her powerful propeller, made straight for the animal. The creature let it come within a half a cable length. Then, showing no interest in diving, it turned and moved a little way off, and seemed content to keep at the same distance. This pursuit went on for about 3/4 of an hour, during which time the frigate did not gain more than a couple of fathoms on the cetacean. It was obvious that if we continued at the same speed, we would never catch up with it. Captain Farragut was furious, and kept tugging at the tuft of whiskers that adorned his chin. "Mr. Land," he called. The Canadian answered the summons. "Well, Mr. Land," said the captain, "would you still advise me to lower my boats onto the water?" "No, sir," replied Ned Land, "because that animal will not allow itself to be taken unless it is good and ready." "So what do we do?" "Maintain full speed if you can, sir. Meanwhile I, with your permission of course, will take up a position under the butt end of the bowsprit. Bowsprit? I'm going to go bowsprit. Under the butt end of the bowsprit. If we get within range, I shall harpoon the animal." "Go to it, Ned," replied Captain Farragut. He then shouted to the engineer, "Chief, increase pressure." Ned Land took up his position. The boilers were stoked even higher. The screw built up to 43 turns a minute. Steam pulsed through the valves. When the log was trailed, it was noted that the Abraham Lincoln was making 18.5 knots. But the cursed animal was also moving at 18.5 knots. For another hour, the frigate kept up the same speed, without gaining so much as a single fathom's length. It was complete humiliation for one of the American Navy's fastest ships. An angry murmur swept through the crew. The sailors swore at the monster, which did not deign to respond. Captain Farragut was no longer satisfied with pulling on his goatee. He started biting it. "Been there, man." The chief engineer was summoned once more. "Are you up to maximum pressure?" the captain asked. "Aye, sir." "And your valves are coping?" "At 6.5 atmospheres." "Take them up to 10. Now there was an American order, if there ever was one. No Mississippi steamboat trying to outdistance a competitor would have gone one better. I turned to my man Conseil and said, "You do realize, don't you, that we are probably about to explode?" "As monsieur pleases," he replied. I don't mind admitting that it was a risk I was very happy to take. The pressure dials rose. Coal was piled into the furnaces. The fans blew torrents of air through the fires. The speed of the Abraham Lincoln increased. The masts shook in their stepping holes, and there was hardly room for the billowing smoke to escape through the narrow funnels. The log was trailed again. "Speed, helmsman," asked Captain Farragut. 19 3/10 knots, Captain." "Put on more steam." The chief obeyed. The pressure gauge now showed 10 atmospheres. But the cetacean must also have put on a spurt, because without extending itself, it too was now moving at a speed of 19 3/10 knots. The chase was on. I cannot begin to describe the feelings which made my very being pulsate. Ned Land remained at his post, harpoon at the ready. Several times the animal allowed us to come nearer. "We're gaining on it! We're gaining on it!" cried the Canadian. Then, just as he was poised to strike, the cetacean would make off at a speed I cannot estimate at less than 30 miles an hour. And when we were going at maximum speed, it toyed with the frigate by sailing in a ring around us. A cry of fury rose from every man on board. At noon we were no further forward than we had been at 8 that morning. At this point, Captain Farragut decided to use more direct methods. "So," he said, "this animal can travel faster than the Abraham Lincoln. Very well. We'll see if it can outrun explosive shells. Master Gunner, order your men forward." Without more ado, the gun in the forecastle was loaded and aimed. The shot was fired, but the shell passed several feet above the cetacean, which was half a mile distant. "Give the gun to someone who can shoot straight," cried the captain. "And there's $500 for the man who pierces the hide of this infernal animal." An old gunner with a gray beard, I can still see him, calm eyes and a cool expression on his face, stepped up to the plate, adjusted the settings of the gun, and took a long time aiming. Then there was a loud detonation, which was accompanied by a loud cheer from the crew. The shell hit its target. It struck the animal, but not in the usual way, for it bounced off its curved surface and ended up in the sea 2 miles away. "I don't believe it," the old gunner exclaimed furiously. "The brute must be armor-plated, with 6-inch steel." "Hell and damnation!" cried Captain Farragut. So the pursuit began again, and turning to me, the captain said, "I'm going to chase the brute until my frigate explodes." "Yes," I replied, "and you'd have every justification." We could only hope that the animal would wear itself out and be affected by fatigue the way steamships are not. But it was not so. The hours slipped by, and there was no indication that it was tiring. But it says much more for the Abraham Lincoln that it battled on with indefatigable tenacity. I reckon that the distance it traveled during that ill-fated November 6th could not have been less than 500 kilometers. Night came on, and wrapped the surging waves in shadow. I believed at that moment that our expedition was at an end, and we would never again set eyes on that extraordinary animal. I was mistaken. At 10:50 that night, the electric luminosity reappeared, 3 miles windward of the frigate, as clear and bright as the night before. The narwhal appeared to be stationary. Perhaps after its exhausting day, it was sleeping, surrendering to the rise and fall of the waves. Here was an opportunity that Captain Farragut was determined not to miss. He gave his orders, The Abraham Lincoln was kept down to low steam and edged forward cautiously so as not to wake its opponent. Now, it is by no means rare to find whales deeply asleep in the middle of the ocean. They are then successfully attacked. Ned Land had harpooned a number while they were sleeping. The Canadian resumed his position on the butt of the bowsprit. The frigate crept noiselessly forwards, stopped engines 2 cable lengths away from the animal, and continued by its own momentum alone. On board, no one dared breathe. A deep silence came over the deck. We were less than 100 feet from the source of the light, which grew bigger and more dazzling as we approached. At that moment I was leaning over the forecastle rail. I saw Ned Land just below me, clinging to the jib boom with one hand, and with the other brandishing his fearsome harpoon. There were barely 20 feet between him and the motionless animal. Suddenly his arm straightened, and the harpoon was on its way. I heard a clang as though the point had struck a solid object. The electric brightness was instantly doused, and 2 huge columns of water fell on the deck of the frigate, rushing like a torrent from stem to stern, knocking men over and snapping the lashing that held our spare masts and yards. There was a tremendous jolt. I had no time to hold on to anything, and was thrown over the rail into the sea. Chapter 7. A whale of an entirely unknown species. Although I had been utterly taken aback by my unforeseen tumble, I nevertheless have a clear recollection of my feelings at the time. At first I was driven down to a depth of about 20 feet. Now, I am a pretty good swimmer, though I would not claim to be the equal of Byron or Edgar Allan Poe, those masters of the art, so my ducking did not make me lose my head. 2 strong kicks with my heels brought me back to the surface of the sea. My first thought was to get a sight of the frigate. Had the crew noticed I had disappeared? Had the Abraham Lincoln changed tack? Did Captain Farragut intend to lower a boat? Could I hope to be rescued? The darkness grew deeper, and I spotted a dark mass disappearing in the east, its fore and aft lights gradually becoming extinguished. It was the frigate. I felt lost. "Help! Help!" I shouted, swimming desperately towards the Abraham Lincoln. I was impeded by my clothes. The water made them cling to my body and hampered my movements. I was sinking. I couldn't breathe. "Help!" It was the last shout I uttered. My mouth filled with water. I struggled as I was pulled down into the depths. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my clothes, and I was dragged violently to the surface of the water, and heard, yes, heard these words spoken into my ear. "If monsieur would be so very good as to hold on to my shoulder, he would find it much easier to swim." I clutched the arm of my ever-dependable Conseil with one hand. "You!" I cried. "It's you!" "Indeed it is, sir," replied Conseil, "and awaiting monsieur's orders." "Did the deluge also wash you overboard at the same time as me?" "Not at all, sir. But, being in monsieur's employ, I followed him." And the admirable fellow considered this to be perfectly natural. "What about the frigate?" I asked. "The frigate," said Conseil, turning on his back. "I think monsieur would do well not to place too many hopes on it." "What did you say?" "I said that, just as I was about to jump into the sea, I heard the helmsman shout, 'The propeller and rudder are both shattered.'" "Shattered?" "Yes, shattered by the monster's tusk. But I think that is all the damage the Abraham Lincoln has sustained. Unfortunately for us, the boat no longer answers to the helm." "So there is no hope for us?" "Perhaps," Conseil said calmly. "But we still have a few hours. and a lot can be done in a few hours." The imperturbable coolness of the man revived my drooping spirits. I swam more strongly, but impeded by my clothes which clung to me like a cloak made of lead, I found it very difficult to stay above water, a fact noted by Conseil. "If monsieur would allow me to make a slit about his person," he said. He slid an open knife under my clothes and cut them from top to bottom with a single stroke. Then he neatly pulled them off me, while I swam for both of us. Then I did the same for Conseil, and we continued navigating, side by side. But our predicament had not been made any less the desperate. Perhaps our disappearance had not been noticed, but even if it had, the frigate could not tack, because it had lost its rudder. Our only hope, therefore, was to be picked up by a longboat. Conseil made a reasoned case for this supposition, and outlined a plan accordingly. What an amazing character! So unflappable that he was perfectly at his ease. Thus it was decided that our only chance of being rescued was to be spotted by the boats from the Abraham Lincoln. We consequently had to think of what we could do to hold out for as long as possible while we waited for them to come. I resolved that we should divide our strength so that we both of us would not become exhausted at the same time, and this is what was agreed. While one of us, floating on his back, would remain still, arms crossed and legs straight out, the other would swim and push him forwards. The role of tower was not to last more than 10 minutes, and by taking turns in this way, we should be able to stay afloat for several hours, and perhaps even until dawn. It was a slim chance, but hope is so strongly rooted in the human heart. Besides, there were two of us, and I can now safely state, however implausible it sounds, that even if I had tried to destroy all my illusions, if I had wanted to give in to despair, I couldn't have done it. The clash of the frigate and the cetacean had occurred around 11 at night. I reckon, therefore, that we had to keep swimming for 8 hours until the sun rose again. If we continued to take turns, this was a perfectly feasible proposition. The sea was reasonably calm and was not taking too much out of us. From time to time I peered into the impenetrable gloom, which was broken only by the phosphorescence caused by our movements. I watched the luminescent waves break over my hands, their glistening veneer freckled with bright flashes. It was as if we were swimming through a bath of mercury. At about 1 in the morning I felt overcome by extreme fatigue. My arms and legs seized up, constricted by violent cramps. Conseil had to hold me up, and the task of saving us both fell on him alone. I heard the poor fellow gasping. His breathing grew short and hurried. I knew he would not be able to carry on like that for long. "Let go of me," I said. "Let me go." "Abandon my master? Never," he replied. "I'd rather drown first." At that moment, the moon showed through the fringes of a huge cloud which the wind was driving eastwards. I almost forgot. You mess up, you have to take a drink. The surface of the water glittered in its light. Its reassuring illumination put new heart in us. My head came up, and my eyes scoured all points of the horizon. I made out the frigate. It was 5 miles from us, and now was just a dark shape, barely visible, but there were no longboats in sight. I wanted to cry out, but from this distance, what was the use? No sound passed my swollen lips. Conseil managed to pronounce a few words, and several times I heard him say, "Help! Help!" We ceased our efforts for a moment, and listened. Was it the singing which the pressure of blood causes in the ear? Yet, it seemed to me that someone had answered Conseil's shout. "Did you hear that?" I murmured. Yes, I did. And Conseil gave another despairing cry. This time there was no mistake. A human voice was answering ours. Was it some unfortunate abandoned in the middle of the ocean? Another victim of the buffeting that the ship had taken? Or rather one of the frigate's boats, hailing us through the darkness? Making a supreme effort, Conseil, leaning on my shoulder while I kicked out madly with my legs in one final convulsion, rose half out the water, then fell back, exhausted. What did you see? I saw, he murmured. I saw. But let's not talk. Let's save our strength. What had he seen? For some reason, the thought of the monster came into my head for the first time. Yet there was that voice. And the days are long gone when the likes of Jonah found shelter in the bellies of whales. Meanwhile, Conseil was towing me again. From time to time he raised his head, looking straight in front of him, and gave a cry, like a signal, to which another voice, drawing closer and closer, replied. I could hardly hear. I was at the end of my tether. My fingers stiffened. My hand ceased to give me any support. My mouth opened uncontrollably and filled with salt water. I was gripped by cold. I raised my head one last time, and then let myself slip. At that instant, I was hit by something solid. I clung onto it. Then I felt that I was being hauled up, pulled up to the surface, and that my lungs were collapsing, and I knew no more. I must have recovered consciousness quickly, thanks to the vigorous friction applied to all parts of my body. I opened my eyes. Conseil, I murmured. Did Monsieur call? Asked Conseil. Then, in the fading light of the moon, which was now sinking towards the horizon, I saw a face that was not Conseil's, but I recognized it at once. Ned Land, I gasped. Here present, sir, and still on the trail of his reward, answered the Canadian. Were you thrown into the sea when the frigate was hit? I was, Professor, but I was more fortunate than you. I managed to find my footing on a floating island almost straight away. An island? Or, more precisely, on our gigantic narwhal. What do you mean, Ned? The fact is, I soon saw why my harpoon had not pierced its skin, and blunted itself on it. Why was that, Ned? Because, Professor, that creature is made of steel plate. I must pause here to collect my wits, refresh my memories, and check the statements I have made. The last words pronounced by the Canadian had brought about a sudden turnaround in my brain. I quickly scrambled up to the highest point of the half-submerged creature or object on which we had taken refuge. I tested it with my foot. It was obviously solid and impenetrable, and nothing like the yielding substance which forms the bulk of large marine mammals. Yet, the hard body could still be a bony carapace, similar to those of antediluvian animals, and I would have settled for classifying our monster as some sort of amphibious reptile, like turtles and alligators. But no, the sable back on which I was standing was smooth, polished, and in no way scaly. When struck, it gave out a metallic clang, and, incredible though it seemed, it appeared, could it be possible, to be made of riveted metal plates? There was absolutely no doubt about it. The animal or monster or natural phenomenon which had puzzled the world's scientific community and overwhelmed and beguiled the imagination of mariners in both hemispheres, there was no avoiding it, was a far more astounding phenomenon, a phenomenon created by the hand of man. Discovering the existence of the most fabulous, the most mythological creature would not have been a greater shock to my reason. For the proposition that all that is prodigious comes from the Creator could not be more straightforward. But suddenly to find the impossible mysteriously and humanly wrought, and staring you in the face, was enough to turn a man's wits. But there was no time to waste. We were lying on the back of some sort of underwater vessel, in the form, insofar as I could tell, of a huge steel fish. Ned Land's mind was quite made up on this point. Conseil and I had no choice but to agree. "In that case," I said, "inside this machine there must be some mechanical means of locomotion, and a crew to operate it." "That goes without saying," replied the harpooner. "Yet I have been on this floating island for 3 hours, and in that time it hasn't given any sign of life." "The boat hasn't moved at all?" "No, Professor Aronnax. It floats on the waves, but doesn't go anywhere." "But we know for sure that it is capable of moving at high speeds, and since an engine is needed to produce such speeds, and an engineer to drive the engine, I conclude that we are now saved." Said Ned Land, doubtfully. At that very moment, as if to support my argument, the water at the stern of this strange vessel began to boil, churned up, no doubt, by a propeller. Then we started moving. We had time only to cling on to its highest point, which sat about 80 centimeters above the waves. Fortunately, its speed was not excessive. "As long as she stays horizontal," muttered Ned Land, "I have no complaints. But if she takes a fancy to dive, I wouldn't give $2 for my chances." Less than 2, the Canadian might have said. It was now becoming urgent for us to communicate with the people, whoever they might be, inside the vessel. I scanned the surface of the craft for an opening, a hatch, a manhole, to use a technical term. But the lines of rivets, tightly bonding the joints between the plates, were clean and unbroken. Add to this that the moon disappeared just then, leaving us in complete darkness. We would have to wait for daylight if we were to come up with some way of entering this submarine boat. And so our salvation depended solely on the whims of the invisible helmsmen who were steering the craft. If they decided to dive, we were lost. That eventuality apart, I was in no doubt about the possibility of contacting them. Because if they did not manufacture their own air, they would be obliged to return to the surface of the ocean from time to time in order to replenish their supply of breathable molecules. So there had to be an opening, which connected the inside of the boat with the atmosphere outside. As to being rescued by Captain Farragut, we had to abandon all hope in that quarter. We were being carried away westwards at a speed which was relatively steady, of 12 knots by my reckoning. The propeller churned through the waves with mathematical regularity. At times it rose clear, and then sprayed luminous water to a considerable height. Around 4 in the morning, the speed of the vessel increased. When waves smashed over us, we found it difficult to cope with being carried along at such a dizzying rate. Fortunately, Ned's hand happened on a mooring ring fixed to the upper part of the iron hull, and we all managed to hang on for dear life. At last the long night ended. My incomplete memories do not allow me to recall everything that happened. Only one detail is clear in my mind. During certain lulls of sea and wind, I thought several times that I could hear vague sounds, a sort of elusive harmony formed of distant chords. What was the mysterious secret of this submarine vessel, which the entire world had been vainly trying to fathom? What kind of people lived inside this strange boat? What sort of mechanical contrivance allowed it to travel at such phenomenal speeds? The new day dawned. Morning fog enveloped us but did not take long to lift. I was about to resume my close examination of the hull, which, at its highest point, took the form of a sort of horizontal platform, when I felt it begin slowly to submerge. "Hell's teeth!" cried Ned Land, stamping his foot on the ringing metal plate. "Open up, you inhospitable lubbers!" but it was difficult to make himself heard against the deafening thrashing of the propeller. Fortunately, however, we stopped submerging. Suddenly the noise of metal bolts being hurriedly drawn back came from inside the boat. An iron plate was raised. A man appeared, gave a strange shout, and then disappeared immediately. A few moments later, 8 burly sailors, their faces masked, came up. Without saying a word, they dragged us inside their amazing machine. Chapter 8. Mobilis in Mobili. Mobilis in Mobili. You put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Our abduction was effected brutally, at lightning speed. My companions and I had not time to take stock of what was happening. I have no idea what they were feeling as they were ushered into this floating prison. For my part, a sudden shiver chilled me to the bone. With whom were we dealing? Probably a new breed of pirates, who were plundering the sea in some way. The narrow hatch had scarcely closed behind me, when I found myself plunged into pitch blackness. My eyes, accustomed to the light outside, could make out nothing. I felt my bare feet grip the rungs of an iron ladder. Ned Land and Conseil were roughly manhandled and followed. At the foot of the ladder, a door opened and was shut on us immediately with a loud clang. Then we were alone. Where? I could not say, nor hardly imagine. It was a dark so impenetrable, that after a few minutes my eyes still could not make out any of those faint glimmers which linger in the deepest blackness. But Ned Land, furious at the way we were being treated, did not conceal his anger. "Hell's teeth!" he exclaimed. "These people must be related to the Caledonians, if this is what they mean by a welcome. They're just one step away from cannibals. Indeed, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's what they are. But I tell you, no one's going to eat me without having a fight on their hands." "Calm down, Ned, calm down," said Conseil coolly. "No need to get all steamed up before you have to. We're not in the cooking pot yet." "Not in the pot, no," retorted the Canadian. "But definitely in an oven. It's as black as the ace of spades in here. Luckily, I've still got my Bowie knife, and I can see well enough to use it. The first of these villains who lays a finger on me—" "Don't get angry, Ned," I told the harpooner. "You mustn't make things worse by uttering idle threats. Who knows if they're not listening to what we say? Let's try instead to find out where we are." I put one foot forward, then another, feeling my way. After 5 steps, I encountered a metal wall, built of riveted iron plates. Then I turned and walked into a table, around which there were a number of stools. The floor of our prison was hidden under thick, fibrous matting that deadened the sound of our feet. There was no sign of a door or windows in the bare walls. Conseil, who had set off in the opposite direction, met up with me, and together we returned to the middle of this cabin, which seemed to be 20 feet long and 10 wide. Ned Land, tall as he was unable to estimate its height. Half an hour had already gone by with no change in our situation, when all at once, from total blackness, our eyes were exposed to brilliant light. Our prison had suddenly been illuminated, that is, filled with luminous matter so bright that at first I could not bear it. By its whiteness and intensity, I recognized the illumination as the same electric light that had wrapped the underwater vessel in a magnificent display of phosphorescence. Having closed my eyes instinctively, I now opened them again and saw that the luminous agent was emanating from a hemisphere of polished glass located in the upper part of the cabin. "At last," Now we can see what we're doing, cried Ned Land, who, knife in hand, had assumed a defensive posture. True, I said, and putting the opposite view, added, but our predicament is no clearer than it was before. Perhaps monsieur might care to be patient, said the imperturbable Conseil. The sudden illumination of the cabin gave me an opportunity to examine it in detail. It contained only the table and the 5 stools. The door was invisible, and was probably hermetically closed. No sound reached us. Everything seemed dead inside the boat. Was it moving? Was it still on the surface of the ocean? Was it diving into the depths? I could not guess. But the luminous globe had not been lit without some reason. I therefore hoped that it would not be long before members of the crew would show themselves. You don't light dungeons when you intend to forget the occupants. I was not mistaken. There was a sound of bolts being drawn. The door opened, and 2 men appeared. One was short, solidly muscled, with wide shoulders, sturdy limbs, a head like a bull, covered with thick black hair, a walrus mustache, keen, piercing eyes, and overall that aura of southern vitality which in France marks out the peoples of Provence. Diderot rightly argued that all human gestures are metaphorical, and this stocky man was the living proof of this claim. You had a feeling that his normal speech would be full of prosopopia. I'm going to go with prosopopia. But rules are rules. You had a feeling that his normal speech would be full of prosopopia, metonymy, and though I was never in a position to confirm this, since in my presence he invariably spoke in a strange tongue that I found absolutely incomprehensible. The other man deserves to be described in more detail. For a disciple of anatomists like Gratielet or Engel, his face would have been an open book, and they would have read it accordingly. I recognized his dominant characteristics without a moment's hesitation. Self-confidence, for his head was admirably set on the arc formed by the line of his shoulders, and the look in his black eyes was cool and measured. Composure, for his skin, which was pale rather than dark, indicated that his blood was not easily stirred. Energy, as was demonstrated by the rapid contractions of his broad forehead, and lastly courage, for the depth of his breathing was a clear sign of his vital powers. I will add that the man was proud, that his calm, assured gaze seemed to suggest high thoughts, and that the harmonious unity of the whole, both the physical gestures and facial expressions, produced, according to the principles of the physiognomists, an unquestionable degree of frankness. I felt involuntarily reassured by his presence, and had a good feeling about our meeting. Whether the man was 35 or 50 years of age, I was not able to say. He was tall and had a wide forehead, a straight nose, a firmly set mouth, splendid teeth, and hands that were delicate, long-fingered, and eminently psychic, to borrow a term from the art of reading chirognomy, by which is meant that they were perfectly suited to serve a heart that was noble and passionate. He was the most perfect specimen of manhood I ever came across. One special detail, his eyes, being set rather wide, made it possible for him to take in at any one time pretty near a quarter of the horizon. This ability, as I subsequently confirmed, was accompanied by an acuity of vision sharper even than that of Ned Land. When he wanted to see an object, his eyebrows came together, his wide eyelids crowded around his pupils, thus narrowing his field of vision. And he looked. And what a look! He magnified objects made small by distance. He could see into your very soul. He could see into the waters of the sea, which are so opaque to our eyes, and read what was contained in their depths. The two men, both sporting caps of sea otter fur and sealskin sea boots, were wearing clothes made of a special kind of cloth that left the body free and allowed great freedom of movement. The taller of the two, obviously the boat's captain, inspected us without saying a word. Then, turning to his companion, he spoke in a tongue that I did not recognize. It was a sonorous, harmonious, supple language, with vowels that appeared to be stressed in various ways. The other man responded with a nod of the head, and added 2 or 3 utterly incomprehensible words. Then he looked directly at me, quizzically, as if expecting an answer. I replied in plain French that I did not understand his language, but he did not appear to understand mine either, and the situation became somewhat embarrassing. Monsieur might care to tell him our story notwithstanding, said Conseil. These gentlemen might grasp a few words of it. So I began the tale of our adventure, pronouncing every syllable clearly and without omitting any detail. I gave our names and ranks. Then I introduced us formally. Professor Aronnax, his man Conseil, and Ned Land, the master harpooner. That man with the gentle, quiet eyes heard me out calmly, indeed politely, and with marked attention. But there was nothing in his expression to suggest that he understood a word of what I was saying. When I had finished, he said nothing at all. There remained the last resort of trying English. Perhaps we could make ourselves understood in that language, which is more or less universal. I spoke it, and German too, well enough to be able to read it fluently, but not to speak it correctly. And circumstances made it imperative that we should make ourselves understood. Look, why don't you try? I said to the harpooner. Over to you, Ned. Rack your brains and try to come up with English as good as any spoken by an Anglo-Saxon, and see if you can do better than me. Ned did not need to be asked twice, and took up my story again. I understood most of it. The content was virtually the same, but the form was different. The Canadian, carried away by his temperament, put a great deal of expression into it. He complained bitterly about being imprisoned in a flagrant violation of international jurisprudence, and demanded to know by what law he was being held there. Spoke of habeas corpus, threatened to prosecute anyone who kept him locked up without reason, raised his voice, waved his arms, and finally, with an expressive gesture, gave them to understand that we were dying of hunger. This was perfectly true, though we had more or less forgotten the fact. To his amazement, the harpooner did not seem to have been any more intelligible than I had. Our visitors did not bat an eyelid. It was obvious that they did not understand the language of Faraday any more than that of Arago. Having exhausted our philological arsenal, and as we were at our wits' end, I did not know which way to turn next. And then Conseil said, If Monsieur will allow, I will attempt to explain our predicament in German. What? Do you speak German? I exclaimed. As well as any Fleming, with all due respect to Monsieur. It is to you that respect is due. Go to it, man. Then, in a steady voice, Conseil related the various episodes of our adventure for the 3rd time. But despite all his elegant turns of phrase and perfect enunciation, the German language proved unsuccessful. Finally, scraping the barrel, I gathered together everything I remembered of my school days and attempted to give an account of what had happened to us in Latin. Cicero would have covered his ears and packed me off to the kitchen. Still, I somehow managed to get through it, but with the same negative result. When this last effort proved to be definitively abortive, the two individuals exchanged a few words in their incomprehensible language, and left without even offering us one of those gestures of reassurance which are standard in all countries the world over. The door closed behind them. It's a disgrace, exclaimed Ned Land, adding to the score of outbursts he had made. We talked to the rogues in French, English, German, even Latin, and neither of them has the decency to answer. Calm down, Ned, I told the irascible harpooner. Getting angry won't get us anywhere. But don't you realize, Professor, said our combustible companion, that we could all easily die of hunger, yes, die, in this iron box? Nonsense, said Conseil philosophically. We can hold out for a long time yet. Listen, both of you, I said. We mustn't give up hope. We've all been in worse predicaments than this. So do me a favor, and wait before making up your minds about the captain and crew of this boat. My mind's already made up, Ned retorted. They're all rogues. All right. And what country do they belong to? Rogueland. I hear the summers there are beautiful. My dear Ned, that's a country which is not yet marked on any map of the world. Though I agree it's not easy to tell what country those two individuals are from. They're not English, nor French, nor German, and that's all we can say for sure. However, I'd be tempted to place the captain and his companion as being born in the lower latitudes. There's something southern about them. But whether they are Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or Indians is not something that can be inferred from their physical type. Add to that, their language is absolutely incomprehensible. That's the disadvantage of not being able to speak all languages, said Conseil, or of not having one single language. That wouldn't help, said Ned. Don't you see that these men have a language that's all their own? It was invented to drive good people who ask for something to eat to despair. But surely in every country on earth, opening your mouth, moving your jaws, miming with teeth and lips is something which is easily understood. Doesn't it mean in Quebec as in Pomatou, in Paris as in the Antipodes, I'm starving, give me something to eat? Oh, said Conseil, there are creatures of little intelligence. Just as he was saying these words, the door opened, and a steward came in. He brought us clothes, sea jackets and trousers made of a fabric which I could not identify. I donned them quickly, and my companions followed my example. Meanwhile, the steward, who was possibly deaf and dumb, had laid the table for 3. This is more like it, said Conseil. It's a good start. Get on with you, grumbled the cantankerous harpooner. And what do you think they eat here? Liver of turtle? Fillet of shark? Dogfish steaks, that's what. We'll see, said Conseil. The platters, each under a silver cloche, were arranged symmetrically on the cloth, and we sat down round the table. Decidedly, we were dealing with civilized people, and had it not been for the electric light that filled the place so brightly, I would have sworn I was in the dining room of the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, or the Grand Hotel in Paris. Still, I must report that there was no bread or wine. Water was served, and it was cold and clear, but it was water. This was not to the taste of Ned Land. On some of the platters placed before us I recognized various kinds of fish, all delicately prepared. I could not say what the contents of others were, though it all made excellent eating, and I could not even have said to what realm, animal or vegetable, they belonged. As to the service, it was elegant and in perfect taste. Each utensil, spoon, fork, knife, and plate was engraved with a letter, and round it was inscribed a motto, of which this is an exact facsimile. Mobilis in Mobili. Moving within the moving element. The motto suited this underwater vessel perfectly, provided the preposition in was translated as within and not on. Doubtless the letter N that was inscribed was the initial of the name of the enigmatic individual who sailed a ship at the bottom of the sea. Ned and Conseil did not bother with thoughts of this kind. They ate voraciously, and soon I was following their lead. However, I did feel more sanguine about our fate, for it was obvious to me that our hosts had no intention of allowing us to starve to death. But everything has an end here below. Everything moves on, even the hunger of men who have not eaten for 15 hours. Once our appetites were satisfied, the need for sleep became overwhelming and irresistible. It was a natural reaction after that interminable night spent struggling with death. "By God, I shall sleep well," said Conseil. "And so will I," replied Ned Land. Both my companions stretched out on the carpet on the cabin floor, and were soon sound asleep. For my part, I surrendered less easily to the overmastering need for sleep. Too many thoughts crowded into my mind. Too many questions without answers pressed in on me. Too many images kept my eyelids half open. Where were we? What strange power was leading us on? I felt, or rather I thought I could sense, the vessel sinking down to deepest levels of the sea. I was possessed by violent, nightmarish visions. In those mysterious haunts I glimpsed an entire world inhabited by unknown animals, to which our submarine boat seemed a related species, alive, moving, just as formidable a presence as they were. But then my brain slowed, my imagination slipped into a fog of drowsiness, and soon I fell into a cheerless sleep. Chapter 9. Ned Land Loses His Temper. How long we slept I could not say, but it must have been for some considerable time, because we woke completely rested after our recent fatigues. I was the first to open my eyes. My companions had not moved and were still asleep in their corner, two inert shapes. I had scarcely got up off my rather hard bed when I felt that my brain was working properly and that my mind was as clear as a bell. I at once resumed my close inspection of our cell. Nothing about its interior appearance had altered. Our prison was still a prison, and its prisoners were still prisoners. However, while we had been asleep, the steward had cleared the table. There was, therefore, nothing to suggest that our situation would change any time soon. I wondered quite seriously if we were destined to live indefinitely in this cage. To me, this prospect seemed all the more dire, because while my brain was now free of its obsession of the evening before, I felt my chest oddly constricted. I found it difficult to breathe. The oppressive air was no longer adequate for the functioning of my lungs. Although our cell was large, it was patently obvious that we had consumed most of the oxygen it contained. It is a fact that in 1 hour, a man uses up all the oxygen in 100 liters of air, which then, being saturated with a more or less equal quantity of carbon dioxide, becomes unbreathable. It was therefore a matter of some urgency that the atmosphere in our prison should be replaced, and most likely, the atmosphere in the rest of this submarine vessel. This raised a question in my mind. How did the captain of this floating residence deal with this problem? Did he obtain fresh air by chemical means, using heat to release the oxygen contained in potassium chlorate, and absorbing the carbon dioxide by means of caustic potash? If so, he must have maintained a number of contacts on all 5 continents in order to have access to the materials required for such an operation. Did he settle for stocking air in pressurized tanks, and then releasing it as and when his crew required? Perhaps. Or did he use a process which was more convenient and economical, and therefore more probable, and simply return to the ocean surface to breathe, like a cetacean, and replenish his air with a sufficient supply for 24 hours? However that might be, and whatever method he used, I felt it would be prudent to implement it without delay. I was already being forced to breathe faster to extract the small amount of oxygen our cell contained, when I suddenly felt the coolness of a current of pure air, which carried the tang of salt. It was, in fact, a sea breeze, health-giving and laden with iodine. I opened my mouth wide and my lungs filled with fresh molecules. At the same time, I felt a slight swell, a rolling motion, which, though not very strong, was clearly the real thing. Obviously the boat, the iron monster, had surfaced to breathe the way whales do. In this way, the ship's ventilation system became perfectly transparent. And it's making me give pause and breathe and just notice it. Thanks, Jules. When I had drunk my fill of this pure air, I looked round for the duct, the aeriferous conduit, if you will, which enabled the salutary wafture to reach us. I soon found it. Above the door was a vent that allowed a flow of fresh air to pass, and thus renew the exhausted atmosphere of our cell. I had got this far in my observations when Ned and Conseil both woke more or less simultaneously, under the influence of this reviving ventilation. They rubbed their eyes, stretched their arms, and were on their feet in an instant. "Did Monsieur sleep well?" asked Conseil, as polite as he was every day. "Very well, Conseil," I replied. "And what about you, Mr. Land?" "Like a log, Professor. I may be mistaken, but is that some kind of sea breeze that I seem to be breathing?" A sailor would make no mistake in such a matter, and I told the Canadian what had happened while he had been asleep. "Ah," he said, "that explains those whooshing sounds we heard when the so-called narwhal was within sight of the Abraham Lincoln." "Exactly, Ned. That was it breathing." "One thing, Professor Aronnax. I have absolutely no idea what time it is, except that it's high time for dinner." "Dinner time." "Ned, I would rather say that it is time for breakfast, for it is patently obvious that today is the day after yesterday." "Which proves," said Conseil, "that we have slept for 24 hours. "That's what I think too," I said. "I won't disagree," said Ned Land. "But whether it's time for dinner or breakfast, that steward would be welcome whether he brought the one or the other." "The one and the other," said Conseil. "Quite right," replied the Canadian. "We are entitled to 2 meals, and speaking for myself, I'd do justice to both." "Patience, Ned. We'll just have to wait," I said. "It's obvious that these people have no intention of allowing us to starve. Otherwise, last night's dinner makes no sense." "Unless they want to fatten us up," said Ned. "Come now," I said. "We haven't fallen into the hands of cannibals." "Maybe they'll make an exception for us," the Canadian replied in all seriousness. "How do we know that these men haven't been deprived of fresh meat for ages? And if that is so, 3 healthy and well-upholstered specimens such as the Professor, his valet, and myself—" "Don't think such thoughts, Ned," I said to the harpooner. "And above all, don't use them as a pretext for letting fly at our hosts. It would only make matters worse." "Perhaps," said the harpooner, "but I'm as hungry as a sack full of demons, and whether it's dinner or breakfast don't signify, since there's no sign of actual food." "Mr. Land," I said, "we must abide by ship's rules. I'm assuming our stomach clocks are fast compared with theirs." "Then we'll have to reset them to local time," Conseil said calmly. "Isn't that you all over, Mr. Conseil?" said the Canadian impatiently. "You never get angry, and you don't get worked up. Always so calm. You'd give thanks before you'd got what you were about to receive. You'd rather die of hunger than complain." "What would be the point?" asked Conseil. Complaining would be the point. It would be something. And if these pirates, I say pirates out of politeness so as not to contradict the professor, who won't let me call them cannibals, if these pirates think they can keep me locked up in this suffocating cage without getting an earful of choice epithets that would express my outrage perfectly, then they are badly mistaken. Come, Professor Aronnax, tell me straight. Do you think they'll keep us locked up for long in this iron tank? To be honest, my guess is as good as yours, Ned. But you must have some idea. I assume that chance has made us privy to some important secret. Now, if the crew of this submarine has some reason to want their secret to stay a secret, and if their secret weighs more heavily in the balance than the lives of 3 men, then I think that I wouldn't give much for our chances. But if the reverse is true, the behemoth which has swallowed us will certainly return us to our world and our friends at the first opportunity. Unless they decide to add us to the crew roster, said Conseil, and keep us here that way. Well, until such time, broke in Ned Land, when some frigate, faster and sharper than the Abraham Lincoln, boards this nest of buccaneers and hangs the whole crew, and us included, from its yardarm once and for all. A cheerful thought, Ned, I replied, but as far as I am aware, no one has mentioned any such thing, so there's no point discussing what line we should take if it happened. I repeat, let's wait, let's keep our counsel, until circumstances change, and do nothing, since there's nothing to be done. On the contrary, Professor, said the harpooner, who was in no mood to back down, we must do something. Like what? Escape. Escaping from a jail on terra firma can be difficult enough, but breaking out of an undersea prison strikes me as being quite impossible. Well, Ned, asked Conseil, what have you got to say against the professor's objection? I shouldn't have thought that an American is ever at a loss for an answer. The harpooner, visibly nonplussed, remained silent. To attempt a breakout in the situation chance had placed us in was quite out of the question. But a Canadian is half French, as Ned Land showed by his reply. After a few moments' thought, he went on. So, Professor Aronnax, you can't guess what men who can't get out of their prison must do? No, Ned. It's very simple. They must settle for staying where they are. True, said Conseil. We're better off inside than above or below. But only after we've rid the ship of the warders, turnkeys, and guards, added Ned Land. Hold on, Ned. Are you serious in thinking about taking over the ship? Very serious, replied the Canadian. But it's impossible. Why, sir? A favorable opportunity might present itself, and I can't see what could prevent us making the most of it. If there are no more than 20 men on board this vessel, I don't think they'd be a match for 2 Frenchmen and a Canadian. It was easier to accept the harpooner's plan than to argue about it. So I merely said, let the circumstances arise, Ned, and we'll see. But until then, please keep your impatience under control. We'll have to rely on subterfuge if we are to make a move, and losing your temper is not the way to create an opening that will improve our chances. So promise me, you will accept the situation without getting too angry. I promise, Professor, answered Ned Land, not very convincingly. No headstrong language will pass my lips. No furious gesture will give me away, even if the steward doesn't wait at table with the appropriate standard of service. So I have your word, Ned, I said to the Canadian. There the conversation paused, and each of us began thinking his own thoughts. I confess that, personally speaking, and despite the assurances given by the harpooner, I had I confess that, personally speaking, and despite the assurances given by the harpooner, I had few illusions. I did not believe in the favorable odds Ned Land had spoken of. You know, the 3 versus 20. To be so safely operated, the submarine boat needed a large crew, which meant that if we had to use our fists, we would find ourselves up against overwhelming opposition. Besides, we first needed to be free, which we were not. I could not envisage any way of escaping from our hermetically sealed iron cell. And if the boat's mysterious captain did have some sort of secret to keep, and this seemed at least probable, he would not allow us to move freely around his vessel. Was he planning to get rid of us by violent means, or would he abandon us one day on some deserted shore? These hypotheses seemed all too plausible to me, and only a harpooner would have had hopes of regaining his freedom. Furthermore, I could see that Ned Land's ideas were growing wilder under the influence of the thoughts gripping his mind. I could hear oaths snarling at the back of his throat, and saw his gestures becoming more threatening. He stood up, prowled like a caged animal, struck at the walls with feet and fists. Meanwhile, time passed. The pangs of hunger became more cruelly insistent, and this time the steward did not appear. If our captors really had our best interests at heart, they were leaving it far too long to remember that we were shipwrecked survivors. Ned Land, tormented by the gnawing of his clamoring stomach, grew increasingly irate, and though he had given his word, I was beginning to fear the worst would happen when he eventually came face to face with one of the crew. Ned Land's anger went on building a head of steam for a further 2 hours. The Canadian called out, shouted, but to no avail. The metal walls did not have ears. I could not hear a sound from anywhere inside the boat, which seemed devoid of life. It was not moving, for I would obviously have felt the hull vibrate as the propeller turned. It was doubtless deep under the water, and disconnected from dry land. The silence was bleak and frightening. As to our being abandoned and left alone in our cell, I dared not try to estimate how long our predicament would last. The hopes I had conceived after our interview with the ship's master gradually faded. The gentle look in the man's eyes, the generous expression on his face, the loftiness of his bearing, were all blotted out in my memory. In my mind's eye, I now saw that enigmatic figure, as he had surely been, cruel and without mercy. I sensed that he did not belong to the human race, being impervious to any feeling of pity, and was the implacable enemy of his own kind, whom he had vowed to hate for all time. But was this man intending to let us die of starvation, still prisoners in our narrow prison, and vulnerable to the ghastly temptations brought on by ungovernable hunger? This terrifying thought took hold of my imagination with horrible intensity, and, urged on by my imagination, I felt myself being overtaken by mindless fear. Conseil was calm, but Ned Land began to roar. At that moment, we heard a noise outside. Footsteps rang on the metal floor. Someone rattled the locks. The door opened, and the steward walked in. Before I could make a move to stop him, the Canadian had leaped on the unfortunate man and knocked him down, and was holding him by the throat. Caught in that massive grip, the steward was choking to death. Conseil was already attempting to pull the harpooner's hands off the half-throttled victim, and I was about to add my efforts to his, when I was suddenly rooted to the spot by words spoken in French. "Easy, Mr. Land. And you, Professor, listen to me." Chapter 10. The Man of the Deep. It was the master of the ship. On hearing these words, Ned Land sprang to his feet. The steward, half strangled, staggered outside on an order from the captain, whose authority on board was such that the man showed no indication of the animosity he must have been feeling towards the Canadian. Conseil, instinctively curious, and I, feeling bewildered, waited in silence for the scene to play out. The captain, leaning on one corner of the table with his arms crossed, observed us attentively. Was he reluctant to say more? Was he already regretting the words he had just spoken in French? It was a distinct possibility. After a few moments of a silence which none of us were tempted to break, "Gentlemen," he said in a calm, probing voice, "I too can speak French, English, German, and Latin. I could have answered you at our first meeting, but I wish to know you first, and think later. Your quadruple tale, each time fundamentally the same, confirmed your identities. I know now that chance has brought to me Professor Pierre Aronnax, holder of the chair of natural history in the Museum of Paris, who has been on a scientific mission to foreign parts. Conseil, his manservant, and Ned Land, Canadian by birth and harpooner on board the Abraham Lincoln, a frigate of the National Navy of the United States of America." I bowed, indicating my agreement. The captain had not asked a question, and thus I was not required to answer. He expressed himself with complete ease, with no trace of an accent. His statements were clear, his words were perfectly apposite, and his fluency quite remarkable. And yet I did not have the feeling that he was a compatriot of mine. He resumed the conversation in these terms. "You will have doubtless thought, sir, that I have allowed a good deal of time to pass without paying you a second visit. The fact is that, having discovered your identity, I wished to give due thought to what I was to do with you. I was a long time making up my mind. The most regrettable circumstances have brought you to a man who has cut all ties with the rest of humanity. Your arrival has upset my way of life." "Unwittingly," I said. "Unwittingly," he said, raising his tone a little. "Was it unwittingly that the Abraham Lincoln has been hunting me down all over the high seas? Was it unwittingly that you took a passage on board the frigate? Was it unwittingly that your shells bounced off the hull of my ship? Was it unwittingly that Mr. Land struck my vessel with a harpoon?" I detected controlled irritation in what he said, but I had an all too natural answer for his accusations, and I gave it. "Sir," I began, "you probably do not know how much talk there has been about you in America and Europe. You will be unaware that a number of accidents, caused by collisions with your submarine vessel, have stirred public opinion on both continents. I shall spare you the countless theories advanced to explain the inexplicable phenomenon of which only you knew the truth. But you must appreciate that in following you into the watery wastes of the Pacific, the Abraham Lincoln believed it was hunting some powerful marine creature, of which it had at all costs to rid the seas." A faint smile relaxed the captain's lips. Then, in a calmer voice, he replied, "Professor Aronnax, are you seriously telling me that your frigate would not have tracked and bombarded a submarine boat as readily as it has a sea monster?" I was nonplussed by the question, for Captain Farragut would not have hesitated for an instant. He would have considered it as much his duty to destroy a vessel of this kind as a giant narwhal. "Then you will understand, sir," he went on, "that I am perfectly entitled to regard you as enemies." I did not answer, and with good reason. What was the point of discussing such a proposition in a situation where force could trump the best arguments? I hesitated for some time, the captain resumed. Nothing obliged me to offer you hospitality. If I were to sever all contact with you, then meeting you again would in no way serve my interests. I could return you to the platform of my boat, on which you took refuge. I could dive beneath the waves, and forget that you ever existed. Would I not be within my rights to proceed in that way? It might be within the rights of a savage, I said, but not of a civilized man. But, Professor, the captain went on quickly, I am not what you call a civilized man. I have cut off all relations with the whole of society, for reasons which I alone am entitled to judge. So I do not obey its rules, and I insist you undertake never to refer to them in my presence. This was said categorically. A flash of anger and disdain had lit up his eyes, and I caught a glimpse of something terrible in the past life of the man. Not only had he placed himself outside the laws of men, but he had made himself independent, free in the most comprehensive sense of the word, and beyond the reach of anyone and anything. Who would dare to follow him to the bottom of the sea, when on the surface of the oceans he could counter every action taken against him? What boat could withstand a clash with his underwater ironclad monitor? What cruiser, however stoutly built, could withstand the impact of its ram? No man alive could ask him to account for his actions. God, if he believed in him, and his conscience, if he had one, were the only judges he could answer to. While these strange thoughts raced through my mind, this man said nothing, seeming absorbed, even withdrawn into his inner self. I looked at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, as Oedipus once contemplated the Sphinx. After a prolonged silence, the captain began to speak once more. As I say, I hesitated, he said, but I found that I could reconcile my interests with the natural feeling of pity to which every human is entitled. You will remain on board, since fate has brought you here. You will be free, and in exchange for your freedom, relative though it necessarily is, I will only impose one condition on you. Your word to respect it will suffice. State your condition, sir, I replied. I assume it belongs with those which any man of honor may accept. Yes, sir. Here is my condition. It is possible that certain unforeseen events may force me to confine you to your cabins, for a few hours or a few days, according to the case. Having no wish to resort to violence in any circumstances, I shall expect total and passive obedience from you at those times even more than at all others. By this means I shall take full responsibility for what happens, so that you shall not be held accountable for anything, in any degree, since I shall have put you in a situation where you could not see what should not be seen. Do you accept my condition? So things happened on board which were, to say the least, unusual. Things which persons who had not set themselves outside the law ought not to see. Of all the surprises the future held in store for me, this would not be the least. We accept, I said. However, I beg leave, sir, to ask you a question. Just one. Proceed. You say we shall be free on your ship. Entirely. Then I would like to ask, what do you mean by freedom? Why, the freedom to come and go, to see, to observe everything that goes on here, save on a handful of occasions. In short, you will have the same freedom as that which is enjoyed by myself and my companions. It was obvious that we were not talking about the same thing. Excuse me, Captain, I went on, but this freedom is no different from that of any other prisoner to walk around his cell. It is not enough. But you must make do with it. What? Must we give up all hope of seeing our homeland our friends, and families ever again. Yes, Professor, you must. But giving up all thought of shouldering the insufferable burden of the constraints of life on dry land, which people mistake for freedom, may well prove less painful than you imagine. Damnation! Cried Ned Land. I'll never swear that I won't try to escape. I'm not asking you to swear to anything, Mr. Land, said the captain sharply. Captain, I said, feeling my anger mount, you are taking advantage of the fact that you have the upper hand. It is cruelty. Not at all, Professor. It is lenience. You are my prisoners, men who fought me and lost. I am keeping you here, though at a word from me I could tip you back into the depths of the ocean. You attacked me. You came with the intention of purloining a secret which no man alive has any right to know, the very secret of my whole existence. And you think I am going to send you back to the solid earth, which shall hear no more of me? Never. By holding you here, it is not you I am safeguarding, but myself. The words revealed that the captain harbored an idea fixe, against which all argument would be powerless. In short, then, I went on, what you are offering us is, in essence, a choice between life and death. In essence, yes. My friends, I said, to a choice framed in this way, no answer is possible. But we have taken no binding oath to obey the master of this vessel. None whatsoever, agreed the captain. Then he added, in a milder tone, and now, please allow me to finish what I have to say to you. I know you, Professor Aronnax. You, though perhaps not your companions, may well have less cause to complain of the chance happening which has bound you to my fate. Among the books which I use for my preferred area of research, you will find the monograph you published on the great ocean depths. I have read it often. You have taken your work as far as terrestrial science currently permits. But you do not know everything, nor have you seen everything. Allow me to say, Professor, that you will not regret the time you spend on board. You will travel through a world of marvels. Your mind will exist in a constant ferment of amazement, of stupefaction. You will not be left cold by the sights you will be continually offered. I shall undertake a new voyage round the world under the sea. Who knows? It might be my last. And I will revisit everything I have investigated at the bottom of oceans, through which I have sailed so often. You will share my studies. As of today, you will enter a new element. You will see what no man before you has ever seen. I and my men do not count. And thanks to me, our planet will give up its last secrets to you. I will not deny it. The captain's words had a tremendous effect on me. I had been caught in my weak spot, and for a moment I lost sight of the fact that seeing such sublime sights could never be a substitute for the loss of my liberty. Or rather, I thought I could let the future come up with the answer to this crucial question. I merely said, Captain, you may well have cut all ties with humanity, but I fully believe that you have not set every human feeling to one side. We are castaways whom you brought on board out of charity, and we shall not forget the fact. Speaking for myself, I am persuaded that if the cause of science can overcome even our need for freedom, then the benefits that I hope will come from our meeting will leave me admirably compensated. I thought the captain was about to offer me his hand to seal the treaty, but he did not, and I was sorry for it on his account. A last question, I said, just as this incomprehensible man seemed on the point of leaving us. Which is? By what name should I address you? The master of the vessel replied, To you, Professor, I shall simply be Captain Nemo. Well, to me, you and your companions will be simply passengers on the Nautilus. Captain Nemo called. A steward appeared. The captain gave orders in the strange language I still could not identify. Then, turning to the Canadian and Conseil, he said, "A meal awaits you in your cabin. Please go with this man." "I don't mind if I do," said the harpooner. Then he and Conseil finally left the cell where they had been locked up for more than 30 hours. "And now, Professor Aronnax, our lunch is ready. Allow me to lead the way." "I am at your orders, Captain." I followed Captain Nemo. Once through the door, we proceeded along an electrically lit walkway which resembled the gangway of a ship. After we had gone 10 meters or so, a second door opened, and I entered a dining room which was done out and furnished in a severe style. A tall dresser of oak, inlaid with ebony motifs, stood at each end of the room, and on their scalloped shelves gleamed objects of china, porcelain, and glass worth incalculable sums. The silver plate shone in the light from the luminous ceiling, on which were painted handsome pictures which suffused and softened the glare. In the middle of the room was a richly laid table. Captain Nemo pointed to the chair in which I was to sit. "Do sit down," he said, "and eat, like a man who must be dying of hunger." Lunch consisted of a number of dishes whose components had been supplied entirely by the sea, and of a few others whose nature and origin I could not guess at. I confess it made good eating, though it had a particular taste, to which, however, I quickly became accustomed. I had the feeling that all these various delicacies must surely be rich in phosphorus, and I assumed they must all have come from the sea. Captain Nemo watched me. I did not ask him anything, but he guessed what I was thinking, and supplied answers to the questions which I was burning to put to him. "Most of these dishes will be new to you," he said, "but you need not be afraid to partake of them. They are safe and very nourishing. I have not eaten food originating on dry land for a very long time, and am none the worse for it. My crew, who are strong and hearty, ate the same diet as myself." "You mean all this food is the product of the sea?" "I do, Professor. The sea supplies all my needs. I trail my nets astern, and when I haul them in they are very full, close to bursting. Or I go hunting in this watery environment, which seems inaccessible to humans, and run down the game which lurks in my underwater forests. Flocks I have like those of Neptune's old shepherd, and they graze on the immense ocean floor, where they have nothing to fear. I have a very large estate which I farm myself, and which is kept permanently planted afresh by the hand of Him who creates all things." Somewhat surprised, I looked at Captain Nemo in silence, and then said, "I fully understand, sir, that your nets supply your table with excellent fish, though I understand less well how you can hunt aquatic game in your underwater forests. But I do not understand at all how any piece of meat, however small, can figure anywhere in your diet." "Which is why," said Captain Nemo, "I have nothing to do with the flesh of land-based animals." "Then what is this?" I asked, pointing to a tureen in which there remained a few slices of beef. "What you think is meat, Professor, is fillet of sea turtle. Here you have dolphin livers, which you could easily mistake for ragout of pork. My chef is very talented, and particularly skillful in dressing a wide variety of ocean produce. This is a preparation of holothurians, or sea slug, which a Malay would say has no rival anywhere in the world. That is a custard, made with milk from a cetacean mother, and the sugar comes from giant North Sea fucus." 1 second. Finally, may I offer you some of this sea anemone compote, which is as good to eat as preserves made from the most delicious fruits. I sampled it more out of curiosity than as a gourmet, while Captain Nemo fascinated me with his most unlikely tales. But the sea, Professor Aronnax, he said. This prodigious, inexhaustible fount of plenty does not only feed me, it puts clothes on my back. The fabric you are wearing was woven from the byssus of certain kinds of shellfish. They were then dyed with the purple known to the ancient world, which is enhanced with the addition of violet tinctures which I extract from the Mediterranean sea hare. The fragrances you will find on the dressing table in your cabin were all distilled from marine plants. Your bed is made of the softest sea grass in the ocean. Your pen is whalebone, and your ink the fluid secreted by the cuttlefish, or calamari. Everything now comes to me from the sea, just as everything will return to it one day. You love the sea, Captain. Of course I love it. The sea is everything. It covers 7/10 of the world's surface. Its breath is pure and salubrious. It is a vast desert where man is never alone because he feels the constant beat of life all around him. The sea is merely the medium which supports the most fantastic, prodigious forms of existence. It is nothing other than motion and love. It is infinity in action, as one of your poets put it. For nature, Professor, is displayed in her three kingdoms, animal, vegetable, and mineral. The first is generously represented by the 4 groups of zoophytes, 3 classes of articulata, 5 classes of mollusks, 3 classes of vertebrates, mammals, reptiles, and innumerable regiments of fish, comprising a numberless multitude of animals, belonging to more than 13,000 species, of which only 1/10 live in fresh water. The sea is nature's vast storehouse. It was in the sea that the globe can be said to have begun, and who can say that it will not also end there, where it began? In it, all is ultimate peace. The sea does not belong to tyrants. They may still exert their iniquitous rights on its surface, fight, exterminate each other, and practice all the horrors they bring from the land. But 30 feet beneath its waves, their power ends, their influence fades, and their power vanishes. I tell you, sir, live in the bosom of the seas. Only there will you find independence. Here I acknowledge no master. Here I am free. Captain Nemo suddenly fell silent in the middle of the effusion which his exaltation had produced. Had he forgotten his natural reserve, and allowed himself to be carried away? Had he said too much? For a few moments he paced up and down, seeming very agitated. Then his nerves settled down. His features resumed their normal, cold expression. And turning to me, he said, "But now, Professor, if you wish to see around the Nautilus, I am entirely at your disposal."